like a futurist. I'm Sheila Shockey, and we appreciate you joining us online as well as in person here today. And so someone recently asked me how this series kind of came about. And in about 2018-19, I started studying futurology, which was interesting to me. And I got kind of overwhelmed by data and information, so I started to kind of try to figure out how do you kind of weed through all of that information, and developed a process that are used by futurists that's called looking at signals. And so we're going to use the book today, Signals, to kind of as our framework a little bit. And then also our role at Shockey, just since the pandemic, has really just been about kind of liberating people in terms of their understanding of the future. And we want to make sure that everybody kind of has an ownership in that future. And by providing a conversation about the future and future trends, we feel like we can kind of do our part to help people be thinking ahead and thinking about the future. And so that kind of is the think part of it, but the drink part of it came in 2020 during the lockdown. And we added drink because I'm sure as most of you people who were thinking about the future were kind of wanting to have a few drinks. And so that's how we kind of came up with the idea of think and drink like a futurist. So since it's the season for the spirits, it's been moving us today. We had our party earlier today for Christmas. And we have our resident mixologist, Tyler Waldorf. Tyler's the director of planning, our planning collaborative. And this series wouldn't really be possible without him. And then our team at Shockey, we've got Jack Shockey in the audience, Liam Mays, Nancy Mays, Taylor Vandevelde, Maddie Hughes, and April Snay, Shelby Ferguson. And everybody kind of worked together today to kind of pull this all together and get us started. So with that, Tyler, tell us how to make your lovely holiday drink.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like Sheila said, I'm the Shockey mixologist. I have no professional training in bartending whatsoever, but I do have a good love of alcohol, and perhaps it's my charming looks, I'm not sure. But anyway, so today's drink, just to get in the holiday spirit, and yes, I'm wearing an ugly Christmas sweater today, is a pomegranate ginger smash. So it seemed festive enough for today's topic. So first of all, you're going to use 1.5 parts of pomegranate juice, and let's see, and then after that, it's then 1 part ginger beer and 1 part vodka. So let me get the vodka in, the most important part of the drink, and that was a heavy pour, so you know, hard to do on the spot. And then the ginger beer. And so hopefully everybody here who has one is enjoying. It is a little ginger forward, but and then our team spent a long time today doing a festive sugar rim on the drink, so hopefully you appreciate that part. And then hopefully for everybody joining us, hopefully you're enjoying a cocktail of your own choice, if not this. And so with that, early happy holidays to everybody, and cheers to water scarcity.
All right, thanks, Tyler. So I'd like to just share with you kind of our series that we use that kind of structures our conversations, and then I'll introduce our guest speakers today. Something that's happening that's a change that indicates that something new might be coming up. And these signals, when put together, you have to think about whether they are strong signals and whether they might be applicable to your organization. And so decoding the signals and analyzing the impact is very difficult sometimes. And so what we like to do on these Think and Drinks is to bring in experts, and I'll introduce our panel here just in a moment. But we're using this book from Jeff Desjardins, and he is the creator of Visual Capitalist. If you haven't gone online and looked at this, he really does a great job of illustrating issues and information in incredible infographics. And his book, Signals Charting the New Direction of the Global Economy, has been our framework throughout this process. And so some of the things that, the signals that are out there and how our world has kind of gotten into this water crisis are things like the growing water consumption, limited fresh water, the proliferation of irrigated agriculture, pollution of our rivers and lakes. Hydroelectric dams have also caused issues in terms of water scarcity, and then the population growth, particularly in arid climates, shrinking snowpack glaciers, wetlands, and aquifers. And so these are all things that you're hearing about on the news. And what happened is those signals all taken together, you really start to understand that the water crisis is something that isn't something that's in the future, it's something that really is happening today. And so global water usage is beyond sustainable levels, and we're talking at the global level here right now. But the country level stress is also important to think about. And if you look at this really great infographic here, it shows that it's a stress map for 2040. And with countries in the dark blue, that shows the ratio of water withdrawal to the available water at 80% or higher, which is extremely higher and unsustainable. Also, we need to think about, that's kind of a global picture and a national picture, so why would we care about that if maybe water scarcity is not something that's happening to us currently? Well, we could experience food insecurity. I think about western Kansas and where a lot of the world's food is produced. If there's water scarcities there, that could cause issues for our food supply. War and conflict is also something we're going to talk about a little bit, and migration and financial insecurity is also a result of water scarcity in other parts of the world. We also see trends in inequality as an issue in terms of water. A country's water supply of fresh water can greatly depend on the geographic location, of course, but other factors such as wealth and demographics can lead to further inequalities in the access to clean fresh water. So this graphic shows the number of people living under water stress with developing countries with a high rate of population density likely to struggle to satisfy their domestic water demand in the future. Rising domestic water demand is the number one thing that can be attributed to the water crisis. But while not growing as rapidly as other sectors, agriculture also has a higher demand for water withdrawals. And that's something in the heartland here that we're mostly concerned about and really could impact our food security. So hopefully, I'm going to just start this one out by #EatBeef because I'm from a background of a family farm with cattle. But really, if you think about that's really been something that more wealthy countries have really been able to have a high amount of beef consumption and animal consumption for our food. But the rising domestic demand for water can be attributed to urban growth, but it also can really be attributed to the global meat consumption that's on the rise, particularly in developing countries entering the middle class. And so as the middle class grows, so does water demand, both because of urbanization and because of consumption of their food products. Urbanization has also led to more consumption and contamination challenges and less fresh water available for consumption as you have more contamination. So water really is vital for all aspects of our life, and there's really a ripple effect that you have to start to kind of think about. Even if it's not happening in your area of the world, there's a ripple effect that can impact us personally. So this graphic kind of flipped me out a little bit. It's an increase in the disputes between countries over shared water resources. So you can see between 1990 and 2018, that really has risen globally. The global estimated cost of addressing the water crisis by 2030 is $1.04 trillion. And so you can see that access to water, addressing water, if you don't do that, it's sucking a lot of resources away from things that are important to us as individuals. So not only is water vital to making these lovely drinks, Not sure why that's doing that. These lovely drinks are made of water, obviously, just a little bit, right? Pomegranate juice probably has some water in it. But it's important to all aspects of life. So one of the things you may not think about is GDP growth. And this graphic here really shows that if there are no changes worldwide in global water policies, that we really can have a slowdown in GDP growth. And with more efficient policies, we could have an increase globally in terms of GDP. And so that's just kind of a little bit of a way to kind of help you guys just put this in context to what we're talking about. So we usually start out pretty global, and then we like to kind of go down to the state level, and then we want to kind of think about local. And so I'm very happy to introduce our panelists today. One of the things all of us have in common is we all grew up in western Kansas and now lived in eastern Kansas, which is interesting and probably why we're passionate about water issues, because we have grown up in an area where water scarcity is the critical issue. Our first speaker is Dr. Les Lampe. When working on water supply projects, Les and I met when he was at Black and Beach. And I would always say that Les is the man about water issues. He is the man. Like, he knows so much about it. I've learned so much from him. He's managed many projects across the world on water supply, water quality, storm drainage, and flood control for clients. He's provided over 100 papers and presentations on water resources, and he's literally led many efforts in terms of technical expertise for international improvements for water all over the world. So he's going to talk a little bit about that today. Probably the best thing about Les, other than his great personality, he got his doctorate from the University of Kansas in water resources engineering, Rock Chalk. And he has chaired many committees, councils, and task forces on water resources and helped many communities address their issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Les, and he's going to give us his perspective.
Is the audio okay? All the sound coming through okay? Good. Thanks for the introduction. That was way better and more than what I expected. I thought it would be just like, well, here's Les, he's retired. He did a little bit of water work over the years, but I'll try to live up to that lofty intro that you gave me. And I appreciate the setting the stage. I'm going to talk about some global and national types of things and how that relate to the three questions that you raised up. What am I most concerned about, or what should we be most concerned about? What are we doing about it? And how do you address scarcity? So some of these examples that I mentioned relate to all three of those. What I'm worried about is climate change and its impact on water. And what you find out is it's the extremes. It's water scarcity, extended droughts, as well as storm drainage and flood control. And we've seen both of those and evidence of both of those in abundance. In terms of international perspectives, I did most of my international work, some in Europe and Middle East, but most of it was in the Asia Pacific region, quite a bit in Hong Kong, Singapore. But what I want to talk about is Australia. And they had a persistent extended drought all the way from 2000 through 2010, and it's bounced back and forth since then. And through that period, my major experience was with the Water Corporation of Western Australia. And it's a utility that serves an area about equivalent to the western third of the United States. So it's a huge water utility, and the primary metropolitan area is Perth. But they have to serve a lot of rural communities, Aboriginal communities where they're trying to maintain the same level of service. What happened to them, they regarded themselves as being the canary in the coal mine for climate change. They were an entirely surface water supply up through the 1990s, and then very abruptly, their inflows to their reservoirs went down to essentially zero. And they scrambled with extraordinary conservation and using available groundwater to meet the demands that they had for the metropolitan area and other areas, and with some success. But they were mining the groundwater, just like Western Kansas, and then the alluvial groundwater was depleting water for agriculture. It was reducing wetlands and habitat, And so they had the whole system of problems that they had to deal with. What they have done to address that is they've moved to a diversified supply. And when we talk about extraordinary conservation, one thing that I should mention from Australia, almost all of the metropolitan areas through that period of time went to what they called the 140 plan, which was in each household, the average use would be 140 liters per person per day. That's 35 gallons per person per day. Well, in the United States, we typically average 50 or 60 gallons for inside house use, not the lawn watering and outside use. So that was extraordinary conservation, and they survived very well doing that. The other things that they've done to meet their scarcity of supply, they've gone to reuse, where they're recharging groundwater with highly treated wastewater in the conservation. But then too, they've gone to ocean desalting. That's an abundant supply. It's right there at hand. And they have two 140 megaliter ocean desalting plants. Those would be about 40 MGD ocean desalting plants. Now, that sounds like, gee, that's great, that's good, that's an abundance of water. But it has its own environmental impacts with waste brine disposal, and it's extremely energy dependent. Use a ton of energy to desalt ocean water. So that's where they are and what they're doing, and they're adapting, but it's an ongoing process. But the emphasis is on diversity of supply and extraordinary conservation. The national issue that I want to talk about is the Colorado River system. In the early 1900s, well, up through the year 2000, there was an abundance of water supply in the Colorado River. The reservoirs were full and they were feeling like, gee, matter of fact, they were dealing with how do they take care of the excess supply and allocate it to the 7 basin states. 7 basin states being Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Nevada. And then all of a sudden, the spigot turned off, the tap turned off, and by the year 2005, they had only 25% of the average flow in the river, and the reservoirs were dropping precipitously, particularly Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And that led them to looking at means to improve their supply. And I was project manager for an augmentation study on the Colorado River, looked at a variety of things, even things like importing water from elsewhere, and cloud seeding and vegetation management and anything and everything that you could think of that they might try to do. But what it got down to was that they have difficulty addressing the issue for political and financial reasons. The Colorado River is on the appropriative doctrine for water rights. And in 1922, they signed the Colorado River Compact and allocated the water to the 7 basin states. And that's like it came down from God. They can't move water, any of those allocations between states, although they're kind of dealing around the fringes of it with some innovative ideas. The one that I particularly liked was that some urban areas could buy ag water rights and retire the water rights, and they didn't call it water going to Las Vegas, they called it system water. Well, system water flowing down the Colorado has the same impact as if, it's going to the metropolitan area, but you had to be creative in terms of how it was perceived or not. But what they've accomplished, and I should mention too, through that period of time of the reservoirs being full in the year 2000, right now they're about 30% full. That's Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And if you go out to Las Vegas and spend too much money, you can look at Lake Mead as you're flying in there, and there's this white bathtub ring around the lake where the water has gone down dramatically. So what they're moving toward is just like the Water Corporation. They're going to reuse, they're going to what they consider to be extraordinary conservation, and they're going to, particularly within a given state, and converting some of the ag supplies into urban supplies. Now, it should be mentioned that 80% of the water in the Colorado River Basin, even though it's very water short, is still being used for agriculture. When you get vegetables and fruits and nuts and all of that in your grocery store, a lot of that comes from Colorado River supplies. And so the study that was completed after the study that I managed, looked at basin-wide the impact of climate change. And at that point, the study completed about 8 years ago, said that the water in the Colorado River was going to decline by about 20% by the year 2050. Well, it's already gone down way more than that in the intervening 8 years. And so that's the other cautionary tale to me is when you look at climate change and you're trying to do your risk assessments and everything like that, use a worst case scenario. Don't look at it like, well, gee, on average, it might be this. No, try to do your contingency planning looking at the worst case. Those were the things that struck me in terms of the international and national experience. And, you know, having spent my entire life in Kansas and then water supply work here too, it kind of struck me within Kansas how that could be applied. You have kind of the three areas, the Western Kansas with a high amount of irrigated agriculture and the High Plains Ogallala Aquifer, some abundant groundwater. You have the eastern part with relatively abundant surface waters. Then you have the middle third where you do work for Hayes and Russell and communities like that. And there are just no really good options. And that's why Hayes purchased a large farm in Kinsley County, 60 miles to the south, back in Sheila's home. And they're planning to move water a substantial distance to supply the community. So that's kind of an overview of global and national types of issues. I think it will feed into the comments from Representative Hyland and from Mike in terms of where we're going more locally. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Les, and we're going to hold questions till the end, and I'm going to introduce our second panelist. It's Representative Ron Hyland. He's the chair of the Kansas Water Committee. He's served the Kansas House of Representatives District 51 since 2013 and has served on many committees and is the former chair of two related committees, Agriculture and Natural Resources and the Agriculture Committee. He lives in one of our favorite client cities, Wamego, Kansas. He exemplifies the leadership we need this country to really come together and be forward-thinking and be passionate about some of our biggest problems. He's brought together a very diverse and bipartisan committee to address this important issue, and this could be the model for us locally, nationally, and at the state level to really address those important issues. So thank you for your leadership, Representative Hyland, and I'm looking forward to your information. And ever since then, I've always enjoyed his forward thinking and just always questions. He asks a lot of questions. So he has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science from K-State and has a law degree from the University of Kansas. He's also a graduate of the Water and Wastewater Leadership Center of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since 2003, he's served as the general manager of Water District Number 1 of Johnson County. So if you're drinking water here in OP, you're drinking some water wine. Water, it's delicious, it tastes great, we love it. Since 2008, Armstrong has represented water supply stakeholders on the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, Mr. RIC, which is a great acronym by any standard. And then they're advising the Corps of Engineers on the operation and management of the Missouri River, one of Water One's primary water sources. He currently serves on the Kansas Water Authority, also a statewide appointed board that provides leadership to ensure that water policies and programs are address the needs of all Kansans. And with that, Mike, take the stage.
All right. Well, thank you, Sheila. I'm not sure if you did this on purpose or not, but it's pretty amazing that this panel actually grew up or was from an area within like 40 miles of one another, because I grew up in a little town called Edson, Kansas, which is actually halfway between Goodland, which is where Les is from, and where Representative Hyland lived in Brewster. So it's pretty ironic, kind of actually kind of bizarre. The good thing is that we're very aligned in a lot of the discussion that we're talking about today. So a lot of the things that Les and Ron said are really very in alignment with what I feel and the position that we have. So kind of some background. Water One is the utility that serves most of Johnson County, and we have 2 intakes. We have an intake on the Kansas River and an intake on the Missouri River, and then we also have what's called a horizontal collector well on the Missouri River that's up in Leavenworth County. So one of the things I think that is important to take away from today, Sheila asked me what I was most concerned about. And one of the things I'm most concerned about is kind of looking at it from a one-size-fits-all. Because one of the things that's really interesting about Kansas, having grown up in western Kansas and then moved to eastern Kansas, is we really have completely different situations as far as our water supply. And so Kansas is kind of crossroads, as Les mentioned, and in eastern Kansas, one of the things I think you need to think about is that we're really blessed with 2 great water sources here. So the whole discussion is about water scarcity, and one of the things that I think is important to think about is we're really blessed with 2 great water supplies. So there are issues, there are drawbacks with each of the water supplies that we have. So while we don't have an issue with water scarcity, we do have some issues on both the Kansas and Missouri River. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about those. So the Missouri River is one of the longest rivers in the U.S. It drains about 1/6 of the United States. So the drainage basin for the Missouri River is over 500,000 square feet. So we're blessed with probably the best water supply per capita in the U.S. There's 6 reservoirs of the main stem of the Missouri River, and the total storage capacity of those 6 reservoirs is over 75 million acre feet. So I really thought that Les would probably get it, since he's an engineer, I thought he would get into all the numbers. So he did talk about liters and million gallons per day, but just to kind of give you some perspective. So a lot of times you hear about acre feet. So if you visualize, an acre foot is basically 1 acre of land, which is basically 205 by 205 covered by 1 foot of water, which is equivalent to about 325,000 gallons. Another thing you'll hear is cubic feet per second. So when you talk about the flow of a river, it's measured in cubic feet per second. And so 1 cubic feet per second is about 640,000 gallons. So there's a lot of different, just like there's a lot of acronyms like Mr. Rick, there's a lot of different measures in water. So at least in the US, the primary ones are cubic feet per second, acre feet, and million gallons per day. So one of the things that, when you look at the Missouri River, even though we have a really plentiful water supply, we are having a problem in the Kansas City reach with riverbed degradation. And so basically what's happening in the Kansas City reach is that there's a scouring or a downcutting of the riverbed. And we noticed that back in 2004. So one of the things on the Missouri River, we have a fixed intake with a port that's at a fixed elevation. So if the river level drops, so if the riverbed drops, the surface level of the river drops as well. And so in 2004, we had a problem with getting water from our intake. So even though there was plenty of water in the river, physically, the level of the water had dropped below where we could bring it into our intake because of this riverbed degradation. And so we worked with the Corps of Engineers. One of the things that you learn when you're in the water industry is if you're working with the Corps of Engineers, it's a slow process and it takes a long time to get anything done, and it's a big effort. So Water One assembled a group of stakeholders using Mid-America Regional Council as a convener and did a study on the Missouri River to try to figure out why the riverbed was cutting down and why it was affecting our intake. So that took the total study to get from the implementation of the study to getting a report took about 13 years. And so the end result was that the problem with the Kansas City stretch of the Missouri River was that there was too much sand dredging going on in the river. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but one of the big industries on the Missouri River is extracting sand for use in commercial activities like producing concrete for construction and other kinds of use for sand and gravel. So that was one of the issues that we identified was a problem. So we worked really intensively with the Corps to try to reduce the sand dredging on the Missouri River. And I'm happy to report that since we started working with the Corps, the sand dredging on the Missouri River has actually dropped by about 90%. So the most recent permit that was issued for the sand dredgers in the Kansas City Reach reduced the amount of dredging that occurred by about 90%. So on the Missouri River, we feel pretty confident, pretty comfortable that we're headed the right direction. So, again, I mentioned that we have, if you look at the Missouri River with those 6 reservoirs, we have about 75 million acre feet of storage. On an annual basis, the most that Water One would need is about 100,000 acre feet of water. So when you look at that relationship, I feel pretty confident that we're in good shape. So as far as water scarcity on the Missouri River, we don't have too much to worry about. And if you look at the climate change models, Les mentioned that you have to scenario plan for worst case scenarios. And, one of the good examples or illustrations that I heard recently is in the past, you kind of had like a tunnel of scenario planning where you kind of looked at what your worst case scenarios were and you looked at history and you could kind of evaluate it within a tunnel. With climate change, it's become more like a cone. So instead of a tunnel with a confined evaluation of what's your worst case scenario, now you're looking at more like a cone. So you have to expand your idea of what's worst case scenario. So on the Missouri, what we're seeing as far as predictions with precipitation is the precipitation is actually going to maybe be slightly more than what we've seen historically. But the problem is there's going to be more droughts and more heavy rainfalls, like Les was talking about, with the storm events and droughts. So that's really what our focus is on the Missouri River as far as planning for being able to look at droughts and flooding. So back on the Kansas River, we also get quite a bit of our water from the Kansas River. And the Kansas River is supplied by several upstream reservoirs. And we've had problems with 2 particular reservoirs. Representative Hyland mentioned the problem with Tuttle Creek. So Tuttle Creek is one of the workhorse reservoirs of the Kansas River. One of its main attributes is flood protection, but there's also a significant amount of water supply there. So Representative Hyland said that there's about 50% of our capacity in the water supply. The multi-purpose pool has been lost to sedimentation, and that's primarily runoff from farm fields and the surrounding areas within the watershed. So one of the innovative tools that we've been looking at, and we've worked with the Corps of Engineers to investigate and design this project, is what's called a water injection dredge. So the idea is that in order to get the sediment that's in the reservoir to pass through, because if the dam wasn't there, the sediment that's being trapped behind the dam in the reservoir would pass down the river anyway. So what we've really created, what the Corps has created, is a sediment trap. So what we're looking at is the possibility of actually trying to resuspend the sediment that's washing into Tuttle Creek and then allowing it to pass on down through the dam structure into the Kansas River. The other advantage of kind of trying to pass that sediment through, when you look at it historically, the aquatic species on the Kansas River really evolved with that sediment in place. And so by eliminating the sediment and trapping it behind the dam, we've actually kind of altered the natural conditions for the aquatic species. And so we're looking at, this is a pilot project, as Representative Hyland talked about. And so we actually have money allocated in the budget through the Kansas Water Office and the Kansas Water Authority through the state water plan to fund this project cooperatively with the Corps of Engineers to pass that sediment on down through the reservoir down into the Kansas River. The other big problem that we've identified on the Kansas River is related to water quality is harmful algae blooms. So you may have heard about some of the problems with harmful algae blooms. There's these massive toxic algae blooms that happen in the reservoirs. Some local small reservoirs have experienced this as well. So what we're looking at is this is mainly related to ag runoff. So there's nitrogen or phosphorus that's running off into these reservoirs because of farming practices. And there's a lot of innovative farming practices that can be implemented to try to reduce this phosphorus runoff. So one of the things that Water One has done recently is organized a group of 30 stakeholders to work with the Department of Ag on a federal basis to try to reduce the runoff. And we recently received a grant from the NRCS, which is one of the agencies affiliated with the Department of Ag, to try to encourage farmers in the watershed above Milford Reservoir to change their farming practices to use things like cover crops, no-till farming, fencing off the livestock, using more precision application of the nitrogen and phosphorus to try to reduce the runoff. So that's a project that is a 5-year project that we've been involved with. That in total it's about $5.7 million. So we received a grant of $2.88 million, which has been matched by local stakeholders. So that's one of the projects to address the issue that Representative Hyland talked about with the water quality. So, those are some of the issues. Sheila asked me, what am I worried about? In the Kansas City area, Water One, we're not so worried about water scarcity at this point. It's more of a bed degradation in the Missouri River and water quality and sedimentation on the Kansas River reservoirs. So with that, I'll just turn it back and be prepared for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. So we wanted to see if we had any questions. I think we have any from the audience. Do we have any questions of our panelists? Yeah, Alan Fenton.
Every year, I think it's every year, Water One run ad, and they say, look at the great job we're doing, here's the national criteria, and we beat them all. Right?
Right.
How is it there's such a hell of a business in water treatment in your house, or bottled water, and everyone doesn't believe you, and so they're all saying, hell, they can't chance it, they'll do it the other way.
That's a good question. That's I think it's marketing, honestly. When you look at the rise of bottled water, it's all a marketing thing, and it's kind of a scare tactic. So I think what you're talking about is the water quality report that we put out.
Yeah.
So annually we put out, it's called a Consumer Confidence Report. So that's an EPA mandated report. So every utility is required to send out, it's basically a report card to say how you're doing. And, we're up against a multi-billion-dollar industry in bottled water. And one of the things so I've got some bottles, actually, I have a little quiz later to give away these bottles. But one of the things, our marketing budget is pretty slim at Water One compared to Dasani and Aquafina and Fiji Water. But I think it's a marketing thing, really. So we have a little marketing campaign of our own to try to recommend or encourage people to use tap water versus bottled water. So if you look on our website, there's a link there to I Love Tap. It's something that we created a few years ago. So not only, I think it's really twofold, really. When you look at the bottled water industry, one is people are spending money on bottled water that they don't need to spend. You can buy tap water you can buy 2 gallons of tap water for 1 penny. So think about that. When you buy a bottle of water, at Quick Trip or whatever, you pay $1.79 or $1.29. You can buy 2 gallons of Water One water delivered to your house for 1 cent. So I think to me, it's a big marketing thing. And it's difficult to try to take on. I kind of feel like we're a little bit like David and Goliath when you look at that. But yeah, I think it's a marketing thing.
Okay, we have a question online from Dee Dee, and she asks, do cities and towns in Kansas have lead pipes? I'm going to ask Representative Hyland to address that.
The funding obviously is the big elephant in the room, and everything that Mike just said is true. And we are lobbying heavily in the governor's office and anyone else that will listen. And our committee identified one of the big areas that we have to deal with is education of the public. And I think once the public understands this whole situation, clearly there will be influence, there will be pressure applied to the state representatives and senators and the governor's office. And that will help. But the problem still remains. That money is allocated to social services and education. And that takes, 63, you take all those together, it takes about 99% of the budget. So is there any left over for us? No. And so we are dealing with that. And we have begun an education campaign where we'll be putting articles in papers to start educating people about how serious the situation is in our state. And that will be a very important part of this entire project. The funding, it's going to be a fight. And but that's why we were elected. So we will get in there and we'll do our best.
Great, thank you. I know I went to high school in Kinsley, Kansas, and their water system hasn't been, a lot of upgrades haven't been made since over 100 years ago. So I'm guessing they might have some lead pipes, not sure, don't know, but it's possible, I would say.
I can answer the question.
Okay, Mike.
Okay, so Water One does not have any lead. Basically, it's lead service lines is the issue. And the thing to keep in mind with the, so there actually yesterday a new lead and copper rule came out. So it's called, it used to be called the LCR, lead and copper rule. Now it's the lead and copper rule revised. So it's LCRR. So it's like a 500-page lead and copper rule came out. And one of the things to keep in mind when you look at lead entering into drinking water, it's not the water that's delivered to the home that's the problem, because the lead that's delivered to the home is lead free. So the problem is when lead leaches into the service lines. And within Water One, as Representative Hyland mentioned, we're a young utility relatively. We came into existence primarily in the 1950s. So we don't have any lead service lines that we know of. We've been replacing our water mains. We've had a water main replacement program that's been going on for about 15 years. We replaced hundreds of miles of water lines within our service area. We haven't seen any lead service lines, so we feel pretty confident that we don't have a lead service line problem. But even if we did, we had a very robust corrosion control program. So really the key is how do you treat the water, and what happens to the water when it leaves your treatment plant. And as long as you have your chemistry in check, the water is slightly depositing. So I don't know if you all live in Water One service area, you might notice that there might be like a slight white film on your fixtures or on your sink if you use tap water, and that's done on purpose. So basically what you want to do is basically coat the inside of the pipeline just slightly with that calcium film, and as long as that's present, even if there's lead present in your soldering or something like that, the lead won't leach into your service line. So the lead and copper rule is something that just got updated, and you'll probably hear more about it in the next few months, but we feel pretty confident at Water One that we don't have any issues.
And I just watched a a webinar on the infrastructure bill, and there's a lot of money available for lead pipe, addressing lead pipes, and so hopefully, if there are Kansas communities that have that, they'll be able to plug into that infrastructure bill. Yeah, how about you?
Yeah, you talked a lot about agriculture and its role, so I'm curious what you see either as concerns or opportunities from an urban growth perspective in terms of dealing with water issues.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. The question was, we talked a little bit about agriculture. What are some of the concerns about urban growth and water scarcity and water quality?
And opportunities.
And opportunities, yeah, opportunities as well. Let me mute. You want to talk about that, Mike?
I can start.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned the Milford Lake RCPP, and so one of the things that when folks looked at Water One is like, why do you care about what happens in the watershed above Milford Reservoir? Well, obviously, water runs downhill, and so anything that they put in the watershed that affects us, we care about. And so, to me, that's one of the programs that we identified as, even though we don't have a problem here locally, we do have a problem in the Milford watershed. And so, Water One has invested heavily. So if you want to take a look at the website, it's milfordwatershed.org. Water One has contributed a lot of in-kind support. We basically built that website, and we have dealt with all of the marketing and the PR for that program to try to encourage the ag producers to engage in that process. So the idea is that if we can reduce the phosphorus runoff in the Milford Reservoir, then we're not going to have those harmful algae blooms, and it will reduce the cost of our local treatment. So there's two things that happen with the harmful algae blooms. One is just taste and odor problems. So you might, in those reservoirs, you smell like a strong musty or fishy odor. And we have a really strong program at Water One to try to eliminate that. A lot of utilities don't put that much focus on it, and so that passes on through. But the most important part is there can be a toxin that's released. It's called microcystin, which is problematic to human consumption. Also, pets and livestock also have problems with it. So that's one example of, I think, where we can engage with a different stakeholder group and work collaboratively to try to resolve the problem. So in addition to the in-kind contribution, Water One also contributed $100,000. So that to that $2.88 million match, Water One contributed $100,000 to help incent the ag producers in that watershed to adopt more environmentally friendly practices. So I think that's one example.
Great, and I might ask Les to maybe follow up on, are there any opportunities in terms of kind of the urbanization of maybe the Kansas City region, and what you see in terms of that trend and how that might impact our communities?
Particularly related to water quality. Where urban areas, they have what they call point source discharges, which are identified locations, particularly wastewater treatment plants that discharge into bodies of water. And then there's the non-point source. For agriculture, like Mike referred to, it's all of the agricultural practices that are non-point sources, particularly the fertilizers and the sediments. In the urban areas, you generate lots of pollutants just from your urban runoff. And a lot of it relates just to things happening on your streets, like heavy metals from your cars that come onto the streets. There's sediments, there's oil and grease, and there's even fecal matter from all of the pets and the birds and everything else. So urban areas are a strong generator of contamination. Now, there are a lot of non-point source activities that are carried out where you try to minimize that amount of runoff and retain the runoff and remove it. And so you have things like rain gardens and swales and everything like that that's being implemented to improve the water quality. And there's a substantial progress that's being made in that regard too, to look at urban areas and not let them contribute to the problem, but to be a means of addressing it. Now, just like Ron referred to, everything takes money. And so, when cities go in there, just like Kansas City, Missouri has a consent decree with EPA to eliminate their wastewater overflows during wet weather. Well, that costs billions of dollars, not millions, but billions of dollars. So everything gets back to, how are you going to pay for it? But there is opportunity for substantial progress.
Technology to kind of think about is really perennial wheat. And so there's a group in Salina that really promotes that, rather than having to replant your wheat every year. They plant actually a perennial, which comes back every year, and it has a really long root system. There's some farmers that I'm aware of that are starting to look into that, primarily because the cross-section of environment and economics is really hit in farming today. So the precision in agriculture, the no-till, some of those techniques are reducing the inputs into the agriculture, because basically their pricing is not, their other products is not going up at that rate. So I'm going to have Representative Hyland talk a little bit about technology and what he's hearing.
As I said, the committee, I took the entire committee out to Garden City, and we visited some technology farms. And what we're seeing is some businesses have started up in that area, and they're working with the local farm groups. And we've got these GMDs, they call them ground management districts. And they're working together, and we visited a couple of farms, and they are putting down probes in the land about 4 feet deep. And they can manage their irrigation from their cell phones. The cell phone tells them when they need to water and when to shut it off. And they're changing the nozzle levels, which have been mentioned, down low, so there's reduced the evaporation. They have found they're reducing their water usage by anywhere from 20 to 40%, and they've increased their yields. So they're learning a lot of things very quickly. I want to dovetail K-State into that program as well, and try to speed that up, if you will. Also, in my district, there's a fellow doing some great research on planting symbiotic plants within your fields. If you have corn, you go ahead and you plant in, say, squash or something else. And the symbiotic relationship, it reduces the water, also pest control, and it maintains the root levels to where you have life in there instead of killing them off with the chemicals. And there's a lot of neat things happening right now. And I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we will see some amazing things happen. But in Western Kansas, these technical farms, one of the fellows started a dairy, moved out here from Pennsylvania to this Selden area, which these folks will know where that is. But in the Selden area, he put in a dairy farm, but also provides all of the food for his animals. But instead of hauling that milk off in great distances, he put in a dehydration plant. So he takes the water out and uses that water then to feed back to his animals. So he's conserving the water and then sending off powdered milk. But there are a lot of things going on. It's exciting to go out there and see all of this. And then I stopped and visited a hemp farm in Great Bend. Amazing things are going on with that. There are a lot of things happening coming down the road.
Great Bend stakeholders, and that was one of the items that the process came out with, was the idea of bringing a hemp farm there. So that's great to hear that you were able to see that. So fantastic. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Brian McCreary.
I had a clarifying question for Mike. And you mentioned the Missouri River. I think you said that the permits were cut by 90% at Dredge.
Mm-hmm.
Is that statewide in the Missouri River?
No, it's just in the Kansas City region.
The Kansas City region?
Yeah, there's really not a problem with riverbed degradation in other areas, but there's something unusual about the Kansas City reach, which the Corps kind of defines as about a 50-mile reach.
Sure.
It's basically
from
from
the confluence of the Kansas River, right across that river probably 10 times a week.
Yeah.
But there's I'm going to call it sand farming, like holiday sand that's dredged and the sand out of the river.
Yep.
Then you also have the maintenance of the navigable channels too. And I don't think that's done by the Corps, but that's probably done by a contractor of the Corps to keep that channel trapezoidal for navigable vessels.
Right.
So I don't know if that was included in that or not.
It is, and one of the things that's really challenging for the Corps of Engineers on the Missouri River is there's 8 authorized purposes. So, you know, one of them is navigation, and that's really kind of the big dog in the fight because they are mandated by Congress to maintain that navigation channel.
Correct.
So it's basically 9 feet deep, 300 feet wide, and I think when you look at you're an engineer, right? So from the engineer standpoint, if you look at the Missouri River, it's a very elegant engineering solution because it's one of the longest rivers in the country, and it doesn't, when you look at it from basically Sioux City all the way to St. Louis, there's no locks, there's no dams. So it's not like the Missouri River or the Ohio River or any of those other rivers where there's a lock and dam system. So it's designed to be self-scouring.
Correct.
And there's a couple of places where there's actually aggregation. So if you go down below Waverly, there's actually a buildup. So the Kansas City Reach from basically St. Joe down to Waverly is where the degradation problem is occurring.
Okay.
And that's where there's like intense sand dredging. And if you look back historically, folks like Holiday Sand and Caw Valley Sand they used to extract their sand from the Kansas River.
Right.
But once the Kansas River started having problems, they moved over to the Missouri, and now the Missouri is having problems. But, you know, the Corps of Engineers has to balance all these interests because one of their mandates is to basically allow this sand dredging to occur. And so they can't arbitrarily shut off the sand dredgers. They have to have really solid data and analysis to prove that up. And so that was a process that we went through to get the dredging permits cut back. And it requires constant evaluation. You know, there's LIDAR surveys that have to be done on the Missouri River. And they have certain thresholds, like they can't, in the areas where they're dredging, they also can't cause the bed to drop more than 2 feet in most areas. But in the Kansas City Reach, it's basically no drop at all. So it's kind of a challenge for the Corps. In some areas, they have to do a little bit of maintenance dredging, where they contract that out, like downstream. But in this area, there's no problem. It's the self-scouring is basically two extremes.
So water one has 2 surface intakes, correct?
Right.
One Missouri, one Kansas, and Missouri is by the Nearman plant, I believe.
It's about a mile upstream from the Nearman plant.
And then Kansas City, Missouri are all submersible wells.
No, Kansas City has an intake as well. It's right across. It's right across the river from the downtown airport.
Okay.
So if you're coming down 169, you know, like Briarcliff, and you make that you make the turn, and then you get real close to the river. Their intake is right there on the right. It's on the north bank.
Okay.
Great.
I know they have pumps down there. I didn't know they actually had it.
Yep. Yep.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's getting close to 5 o'clock, and I wanted to thank our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. So I think you can see very clearly that water issues and water scarcity and water quality is a very complex issue. It's a very local issue, as Mike said, and it takes people like water utility directors, experts, policy folks, legislative people, and us to think about how can we solve this issue together.